You can't love people and be a people pleaser. And a lot of times creatives, we're wired to innately be a people pleaser because we want people to like what we create. And if we create something and if somebody doesn't like it, then oftentimes we're gonna be like, oh no, we fall apart because whatever we created, we kind of tied our value and worth to and our identity to, and then that kind of rocks us.
Welcome to Worship Fuel. My name is Matt McCoy. I'm the president of CCLI and the host of the Worship Fuel show. Today we're talking with Erik Gaylo. Most worship leaders end up creating in isolation, but the church was designed for collaboration. And this episode explores how to build healthy, creative community, lead with a clear vision, and bring multiple voices into the process without things getting too messy. We're going to ask Erik to share practical and spiritual insight on how identity, preparation, and trust in your worship team shape great collaboration at your church. Erik Gaylo is a worship leader, songwriter, and leader of Table Songs, a ministry focused on creating community for worship leaders and songwriters. He writes and releases new songs for the local church with Table Songs and raises up the next generation of songwriters and creatives. Erik, you're a good friend. I'm glad to finally have you on the Worship Fuel show. Good to see you.
Thanks, man. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks for joining us, man. Where are you tuning in from here? Where are you
man,
beaming in?
We were just chatting a little bit before this conversation, and I'm out in Iowa, North Iowa to be exact, a little town called Clear Lake. I'm a worship pastor at a little church out here, and I love it. And it's a little lake town. So I like to say that in the summertime, I should say in the off season, the wintertime, it's probably about, 12,000 people. Right. But in the summertime, it like quadruples in size. And so it's just a very unique little town in the middle of nowhere. And so it's a sweet opportunity to get to steward things in a house and build culture and help people sing to Jesus, read their Bibles, and love their neighbor. And
it's awesome, man.
It's a sweet season of life right now. But I used to live in Chicago. That's how I met you back in the day. And we got to lead worship at a church together, and it's been really cool to watch all that God's done in your life and kind of run parallel with you in the process.
Yeah, same, man. It's been fun to watch you really pour into Table. And I remember you invited me out to one of the Table nights that happened here in Chicago. Yeah, and you recorded a couple songs at that night. But, this grew from Table grew from a Thursday night or a Sunday night, young adult ministry.
Yeah,
so now
kind of
writing songs and tell us the journey of that a little bit.
Yeah, the short version, because it's a long story of, I moved to Chicago back in 2020 after just a lot of life stuff that happened in my life. And God did a lot of transformation in my heart and my mindset back then. And, I went from, I think, doing a lot of ministry with I like to say God's work with man's metrics, right? And ultimately to find that it doesn't work. Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And you can do that with a guitar strapped around your neck or an apron and a pot of coffee. And that was kind of the season of life where God had to teach me that, because I had been leading worship for probably a good 10 years prior to that. And it had kind of become a big part of my identity. I was Erik the songwriter guy, Erik the worship leader guy, and I placed my root system and identity in that. So in 2020, God kind of used COVID and all the things that brought me to Chicago to kind of root that out of me. And so I didn't really lead worship for probably a good year, a little over a good year. And during that time, I built a lot of relationships in Chicago. And I think God was doing something very, profound in the midst of COVID, kind of showing us that a lot of what we called community and a lot of what we kind of were investing ourselves in was really kind of just a facade. And so COVID kind of showed us that when we're in the four walls of our bedrooms day after day, if you remember that, couldn't go out of our house or do anything for a long time. And that a lot of us kind of realized, hey, look, I have a desert of an interior life. The things that I call community and thought were community, really aren't existing. And so what am I doing about this? How am I going about this? And so towards the end of COVID, I invited some friends over to my house one night, and 8 friends showed up, and we just celebrated the goodness of God and shared a meal together. And we started doing dinner at Erik's every month. And it kind of grew into this young adult ministry that kind of grew and grew until, it got to a spot where we had a lot of people involved. And we had an internship that we started called Table Songs. And that's how Table Songs started. It was just we had all these kids, say that loosely, coming to the table every month and asking questions like, what does it mean to write songs that bless the heart of God? How do we lead worship in a way that blesses the heart of God? Because so much of Western culture, Matt, I think you know this and see this, is, if you're pretty and can play a G chord, we put you on stage and call you a worship leader. And that's just a very dangerous way of kind of going about discipleship. It's a very dangerous way of going about just church culture, worship ministry culture. You're not fathering or mothering the individual. You're just kind of using them as a cog in the machine of the operation. And, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so what does it mean to love your neighbor well, to kind of do both those things hand in hand? So that's kind of what we kind of started in, and then we grew to where we are today. We have 26 people who operate Table Songs from around the country. We do things from doing writing camps with churches. We write and release music. We have an online community that we facilitate. We're building right now, focused on building tables, what we call them. The main one being in Nashville, Tennessee. We're working on the early stages of one in Jacksonville, Florida, and Kansas City as well. And praying our way through that process and just watching God build community for worship leaders and songwriters. And
It's awesome.
It's I think this from having been in the local church world as well. It's very isolating being a local church guy oftentimes. Yeah. And so, having been a local church guy for 20 years now, there's not much that surprises me anymore.
Yeah.
And I've seen just about everything that can happen on a local church level in ministry. And I've seen guys and gals, mostly guys, kind of just fall apart oftentimes because they'll either burn out because they don't have good community or reciprocal ministry in their life, or, they'll find themselves in a moral failure or some kind of situation that they're like, okay, what the heck? Because oftentimes you can, like, when you're working at a church in a worship capacity, worship leader capacity, you have, your revenue, your income tied to it. You have your community tied to it. You have so many layers to this that if something happens at your church, it's not just you lose your job, you lose a lot of things. And so oftentimes you'll find guys who are out on the street because of something that happens, whether due to their actions or due to a culture situation at a church, or just something happens, right? And then you get kind of left out there hanging. And I've seen that time and time again. And so part of what Table does is provides these a place for folks in worship ministry just to find a place to belong outside of just their local church, So when stuff does hit the fan, when stuff does make a left turn, you're still in community,
Yeah.
And it's been really beautiful to watch how God's made a way for that.
Yeah. Well, that's really what I want to talk with you about a little bit today, because I love that you called this ministry Table, because it is bringing people together to a table, to whether that is worshiping together or whether it's eating food together or writing songs together. And I agree with you that worship leading can be a very isolating thing. I've seen a lot of worship leaders who are on staff at a church. And what ends up happening is they are maybe like one of the only creatives in a staff of, maybe 20, 30 people.
Yeah, right.
And no one understands them because they're like, why is this person not showing up on time? Why is this person not like really great with spreadsheets and all the business administration and filing expense reports and turning in receipts? And there's a lot of frustration. There can be tension between the non-creatives in the church. And so you've got this worship leader who's really alone. They are surrounded by a ton of other people on a staff, but they're alone. They're not understood. They don't feel understood. And I really want to pick your brain about collaboration and how worship leaders can be better in community, how we can collaborate better so that you aren't alone. Because I do think that when you're alone, that's when, burnout happens pretty quickly. So let me ask you, Erik, why do so many worship leaders default to doing things alone? And what are we missing when we do?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to first identity. I like to say it's knowing who you are and whose you are. When I say who you are, it's knowing, okay, first, I'm a child of God, right? Scripture says you are loved with an everlasting love. I tell my team all the time, this is your identity and this is your confidence today. But then whose you are. All right, you belong to God. The Apostle Paul says, I'm a slave to Christ, right? I was bought with a price, right? And so knowing who you are and whose you are. But furthermore, when I talk about identity, I think like the metaphor of like a tree and a root system. Where do you plant yourself? Like Jeremiah says, a tree planted by the water will not get burned up when the fire comes, right? So where's your root system? So is it rooted into something that's life-giving and proper ground or improper ground, right? And so oftentimes I see a lot of worship leaders, and I was guilty of this myself for a long time, who will place their root system and their identity into things that are Jesus adjacent and not Jesus. So for me, like I mentioned in our early part of our conversation, like I was Erik, the worship leader guy. I was Erik, the songwriter guy, right? That was how I identified myself. That's how I kind of rooted myself. And it's very easy to do. I watch a lot of young leaders kind of do that. And then ultimately God has to kind of, walk them through some things to uproot their root system and place it right again. And so there's a very, fine line oftentimes between rooting yourself in Jesus and rooting yourself in something that's Jesus adjacent. And so the way I kind of use a litmus test, or the litmus test, I should say, that I use to kind of determine where I'm at with it and where others are at is like, all right, how would you describe yourself? And kind of go from there. Because if somebody starts with like, oh, okay, well, they start listing off all their career things or all the other things, like, and those are wonderful things. But like, if you have the self-awareness to be able to say like, hey, I'm a child of God who gets to do XYZ, who gets to do XYZ, who gets to be in this context, then that's like, okay, you have a healthy like awareness and context for who you are and whose you are. And that's everything. Cause like you can't have healthy relationships without that, particularly like in a world where it's like all about like creativity and deliverables in a way, like, man, I can't sing like this guy and you're going to feel insecure, or I can't do this like this guy and you're going to feel insecure, or whatever context you want to kind of put that in. Right. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, if I know that like I'm Erik, a child of God who was bought with a price, who is loved with an everlasting love, like who gives a crap if so-and-so can sing better than me or can do whatever spreadsheets, right? Better than me, because that's not where my value and my identity is. And so I'm able to love this person in a way that is the way that Jesus would. That leads to another conversation about the idea of loving people versus being a people pleaser. You can't love people and be a people pleaser. And a lot of times creatives, we're wired to innately be a people pleaser because we want people to like what we create. We're built to create. And then if we create something and if somebody doesn't like it, then oftentimes we're gonna be like, oh no, we fall apart because whatever we created, we kind of tied our value and worth to and our identity to, and then that kind of rocks us. And so, oftentimes you can get up on a Sunday morning and lead worship and set doesn't go well and you walk off the stage and you're like, oh, that just didn't go great. And then that's either going to crush you or you're going to remember who you are and whose you are. And you're going to be like, all right, let's figure out what went wrong. Let's fix it and make it better next time. And that doesn't rock who you are as a person as a result, And so I say all that to say, because when it comes to relationships, like it's all about loving your neighbor. All right. And so if you're going to approach like collaboration, it comes down to, serving one another, but then also in that loving your neighbor. So the question that I kind of tell folks when you approach co-writing in particular, but I think there's a lot of parallel between like, a healthy community as worship leaders, but also songwriting. And so I think the first parallel to say is like, when you walk into a co-writing room, the first question you ask is like, all right, well, how do I love the people in this co-writing room right now? Because first and foremost, like I'm co-writing with Jesus. Jesus is in that room with me or with us, right? But then secondly, like, okay, so what does it look like to serve the people in this room? What does it look like to love the people in this room? What do I have to bring or to give versus coming in to take, right? And so you can't bring something or take or to love if you're coming at it from the perspective of being a people pleaser, because a people pleaser is somebody that needs to have validation from the people around them versus coming and sacrificing and bringing something, right? The Apostle Paul talks about the idea of love, and he breaks it down. He says love is patient, love is kind, is not proud, is not rude, right? He lists off all these things that describe what love is. And so if you were to take the word love and replace it with like your name, right? And say like Erik is patient, Erik is kind, Erik is blah, 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 right? Or Matt or so on, right? And then if you start thinking that way and kind of putting your name in it, that kind of allows you to kind of change a little bit of your perspective of how you're approaching the conversation, of how you're approaching the room that you're in. And then
I've heard it said before, like God is love. Yeah. And then it says love is patient. So yeah, it's interesting to replace your name with that too.
Yeah. And so, I kind of say that context first because I think that's important when approaching any kind of collaborative environment, whether it's songwriting or like maybe you're at a church where you have a kind of a larger creative team and you have to work with different personalities, or maybe you don't even have a creative team at all, like you mentioned. Like right now I'm at a small church here in North Iowa where we have a small staff and I am the creative guy on staff. I'll venture to say most churches in America probably fall in a similar category, right? Like a smaller church with limited resources, limited staff. And so when you walk in, I'll use my own pastor as an example. I love him to death. Great guy. Drives me nuts. So someday when he watches this, he can hear that and we can pick on each other. But he is probably the least creative guy that I know. The running joke is that like if I'm not here on a Sunday and I don't have a backup plan to cover the house, if I'm gone and he has to lead worship, we're going to lose half the church. And so when we go into a creative meeting, thinking about like, let's say Easter or Christmas, like he is for sure not going to be the guy that's going to look at it from like, okay, how do we make this pretty? How do we make this beautiful? Right? How do we make this something that like evokes emotion? He's going to look at it from nuts and bolts. This is what we did last year. This is what we did the year before. And how do we make it better than the last 2 years? Right. And so, as a worship guy, I'm going to look at it and be like, okay, well, yeah, we need to think about those things, but also how do we help the people worship? How do we help them have an encounter with the Holy Spirit in that service? And so I'm going to look at it from a way of like, all right, how do we bring creativity into this to where it's going to evoke emotion and create atmosphere? And he is not going to think like that at all. Right. Mm-hmm. So I have to figure out how to work with his perspective when he's not going to really understand mine. But I also then have to explain my perspective to him in a way that can meet him where he's at, to where we can find some commonality and common ground to ultimately achieve the goal together. And so that's just, again, how do I approach this from a perspective of like, Erik is patient, Erik is kind. How do I love my neighbor? How do I love my pastor in this case, right? Or whoever I'm trying to collaborate with, I think the key there is knowing, again, who you are and whose you are. That even if something that, you bring is vetoed, or somebody just thinks like, oh, it's a crap idea or whatever, it's not going to rock who you are. And you can still create because God made you to create and you're his, and you're rooted in who he says that you are. You
covered a ton of topics there. And I want to rewind like 5 topics to the very beginning one, which is identity. Let's dive into that just a little bit about that. You talked about how it's really important that a worship leader has their identity rooted correctly.
Yeah, right.
Where do you think that goes sideways? Is it because worship leaders get into worship leading with the wrong motives? Is it because of maybe the structures of the church? You talked a bit about like paycheck and your whole like community, your job, everything is wrapped into this one thing.
Right.
Is it the structures that we've done? Like, have we failed worship leaders in that regard? Or where does the identity piece really get twisted? Is it the whole social media world? Is it worship celebrities that have caused this?
Yeah.
Like, where has this gone sideways?
I mean, I'll just speak for myself and my journey. Like when I was younger, I grew up at a very large church in New York. And, the culture and the metric system there was, like, I would say I was not discipled or fathered into worship ministry. I was taught how to lead a band. I was taught all the mechanics, but I really didn't know what it meant to bless the heart of God. I looked around and I saw like all these people that, some of whom I call friends now, who were like the big names in worship music, right? And, the metric system was like, all right, to be a successful worship leader, you had to sing like Phil Wickham, and you had to have a record deal, and you had to do all these things, work at a big church, and Like these are all the man's metrics, I'll say, that were being, I'll probably say subliminally communicated as like success as a worship leader, right? And so I'm like, all right, if I'm going to be successful at what I do, then it has to be, a summary of all these things. And so that's what I chased for a long time. I chased the whole artist thing. I chased the whole songwriting thing. And, it got to a point where like the Lord in his mercy and kindness allowed me to open for Casting Crowns and play stadiums and do all these things that, like, frankly, I realized at the end of the day, like, God really didn't give a crap about. Jesus says his metric system is love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you could do that doing anything. It doesn't matter. And so if God gives you the opportunity to have a guitar around your neck, then great, And so in my mind, it's like, all right, what does it look like to partner with the Lord? Because the Apostle Paul says we are co-laborers with God. And so that means God's got an agenda. And so how do I partner with God and his agenda? What does it look like to be a good steward and to be faithful? So there's actually a couple questions I ask. So one is, what does faithfulness look like for today? Like faithfulness tactically for me today is very different than it was 6 months ago or a year ago or 5 years ago, right? And so then the other question I ask is, what does love require in the conversation, right? Oftentimes love requires me to shut up and listen, right? But you cannot love without sacrifice, and you cannot be faithful without sacrifice, right? And so, you're a married man, when you married your wife, you gave up all other women to be faithful to your wife. And so, like, if God calls you to something, he says, okay, be faithful. Like, that means you have to sacrifice something to be faithful with that. And so what does faithfulness look like for today? And so, when I think about like identity, I think about like, all right, well, first off, what's my metric system? Is it God's metric system or is it man's metric system? Because you can do like ministry with man's metrics and be successful, right? And that's something, frankly, I even wrestle with still with Table. Like Table does stuff that isn't always sexy, man. Like, yes, we get to write songs and do records and, kind of do some cool things with the Lord. But there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that is a lot of sacrifice that my team and I have to do regularly. And that's not stuff that gets put on Instagram, that's stuff that oftentimes is just kind of held in anonymity with the Lord, And so, yeah, what's your metric system? Is it going to be, man's metric system? Hey, I'm going to do whatever I have to do to climb to the top to be the guy. Or is it like, am I going to partner with the Lord and what his agenda is? Jesus says the greatest among you will be a servant. He says that the first shall be last, right? It's a backwards metric system, He says, what you do for the least of these, you do for me, It's very easy to be like, oh, I want to be the guy who gets on the big stage and does all the things. But all right, when was the last time you went and led worship at like Celebrate Recovery? Or when was the last time you went and led worship like for like your jail ministry? Or when was the last time you went and just like led worship for like the Little Tykes, like, somewhere in like Bible camp, like what you do for the least of these, you do for me, So I think that's, the way to kind of measure or check yourself as far as like, hey, am I coming from a place of a healthy root system, or am I striving to be something, to earn my like identity from what the world's going to tell me or the worship industry is going to tell me I need to do, or am I looking to Jesus to kind of set the metric system? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So when it comes to songwriting, planning worship sets, planning creative elements at church, when worship leaders do it alone, what do you think worship leaders are missing? Oh, man.
I think let me approach that two ways. One, I think there's something really beautiful and special about like writing with Jesus by yourself and just you and him, having a prayer life and a songwriting life between you and the Lord. I think is very important. If God gives you the gift to write songs, like being able to share that with just you and him is I think the fulfillment of that gift, right? Because we write first to bless the heart of God, right? And so I first want to acknowledge that's something special. Cultivate that in your prayer life with the Lord. Most of the songs that I write will never see the light of day, and I'm sure there's many other songwriters who would say similar things. And so the importance of first having like a private prayer life, a private songwriting life with the Lord is key. But as far as co-writing, what you're missing, I think, is I think sum it up is the word community. Paul talks about, the idea of the body of Christ as many parts, And so when you go into a co-write, I've found the best co-writes and the best songs come out of rooms that are a combination of people who are very different than you. So like for me, for instance, like I tend to lean very heavy on like lyric, melody, I'm not really like a verbal processor in a writing room, and that's a muscle that I've had to work on a lot. So like there's some folks I'll get in a room with, like there's a guy like Michael Farron, like he's an absolute beast of a songwriter, and like the guy can just like riff stuff out like nobody's business. That's a skill, that's a muscle that has to be developed to be able to do that, right? And so some people can naturally be that way. Other people are a little bit more like critiquey, I'll say, right? So I'm the kind of guy who will like sit and process through like, a worksheet, right, or a document as we're writing, and kind of like, oh, here's a better way to say this. I'll take what like somebody like maybe a Michael Farron who can like spit stuff out like crazy and kind of refine it like in a document, right? Or like and be able to kind of make it the best version that it can be, right? But then I also need somebody like another friend who can just like, man, the melodies and the music that they can come up with, like the inversions and all the ways that you can play it, like, man, like that's another like special like skill set. And so when you can have a combination of like those different things, like you're all bringing something to the table,
Yeah, people and their superpowers.
Yeah. And how do you celebrate each other and what each person has to bring? But then also like having the awareness of who you are and your strength, right? But then also like some co-writes, like, I found I get to be, kind of the back seat and just support like what, we're doing for another artist, right? But then there's other times, like there's always a leader in a co-write, there's always a leader in the room. And that tends to just happen naturally, There's some folks who I've seen like try really hard to be the leader in the room. And it kind of goes back to the, topic I was talking about like, how do we love the people? How do we serve the room? And how do we approach the room from a posture of, what do I have to bring and serve versus get out of,
I was going to ask you, Erik, I mean, you've facilitated through Table Songs a lot of different co-writing groups with creatives, but you've probably also sat in on a lot of co-write groups.
Yeah.
Where does it usually break down? Like when you walk out of a co-write and you're like, ooh, that was rough, or that just like didn't work. Like where did it break down? What was the problem?
I'd say the core of it is going back to what I've been saying about like, you have people who are coming into the room who aren't there to serve the room, aren't there to love each other. I think if you go into any writing room with the expectation that like, all right, I'm just here to write a song, and not prioritizing and valuing relationship above the songs, ain't nobody gonna want to write with you again. Right? Because at the end of the day, like relationship is everything. Like there've been so many like co-writes that I've done where like, the songs were mediocre, but man, like we spent time with Jesus together. We laughed together. I made a new friend together. Like I got to pray over somebody. Like that's success in my mind. Like there's a friend of mine, who's told me a story. He wrote a little song called Worthy of It All. And, he told a story about he got in a co-write one day, and there's a guy who said like, we're here to write a banger. And like his whole focus was just like, we're here to write a banger song. Right. And then it's just like, okay, well, great. But like, okay, so you write a banger song, then what? Is the person want to write with you again? Is that person want to spend time with you again? Like you get a great song out of it. Great. Then what? At the end of the day, like what does God prioritize? God prioritizes people, prioritizes relationship, So if you approach like, like, oh, I need to get in a room with so-and-so and so-and-so because I'm going to be able to write a song that could maybe hit the top 10 on CCLI and be blah, blah, blah. Right. And it's nonsense. Right. Like that's not the metric to go by, Like if you go at it from the perspective like, hey, God's allowing me to get into a room with like somebody, and how do I bring something to it? How do I love this person? how do I make them walk out of this room feeling like they had spent time with Jesus? Then like that's the win. And then if you get a song out of it, then great. Now, I'm not saying all that to say that there isn't like craft involved. Like, yeah, scripture says all the musicians in the tabernacle were skilled in music for the Lord. So like, all right, go be good at your craft. Go learn the craft of songwriting, go work on it. It says like a master in their craft has to spend 10,000 hours on their craft, so go do that, But like, if you're just focusing on the craft and not on the people, and you're missing like ultimately how God designed like co-writing to be, particularly in worship, because you're writing for the church, and the church is made up of a bunch of people. And so when you get in a room with people to write for God and his people, like there's something sacred in that, and so if you're going to go about it in a way that doesn't align with God's heart, then how do you expect the church to be able to, well, first, how do you expect to bless God's heart that way? Right. But then secondly, how do you expect the church to be able to actually resonate with something that isn't being done in alignment with the heart of God?
What do you think is the hardest part about being a worship leader?
The hardest part about being a worship leader for me is, so I'm an introvert and I have ADHD. And so I like to say I love people, but I don't always like them. Or sometimes I just like them to leave. And I get peopled out pretty easy. So I've had to learn, though, that like, you can't love people unless you're with people. And so as an introvert, like, yes, like that's not a handicap. That's just the way that God wired me to be able to recharge. And so oftentimes I've seen introverts be like using their introversion as an excuse to not be present or with people. And I don't think that's accurate, right? And so that's been an area of growth in my life that the Lord's had to do and work. I've had to work through. But then the second piece was I have ADHD, and so I tend to hyper focus a lot, or I go into squirrel mode, I like to say, where I'll be so scattered in 6 million other things. And but I've had to learn how to slow down and be present with people, and how to not be so focused on the work that I leave people behind. In my younger years, like I used to do that a lot, and that's been a big part of my transformation and growth. And I would say those things are probably for me kind of the hardest things about leading worship or being a worship pastor, because I had an old friend tell me once that the job of a worship leader is to love the people more than the music. And it's a nice thing to say, like here on a podcast or at a conference, but when it actually comes down to it, it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that look like tactically? That means like probably making some sacrifices, like for instance, with table songs, like, by God's grace, I have a team of folks that I work with who are very, very skilled at what they do. But then I come home and then I got John Doe, farmer, who's just trying to, serve in his church, and how do I, slow down and be present and help them serve and bring their offering, or John Doe insurance guy, who's trying to do the same thing. And, Jane Doe stay at home mom, homeschool mom who's just trying to do the same thing. And so like, it's easy to kind of like get so focused on like, all right, we want this to look really good. We want this to sound really good. We want this to be so put together. But like, all right, well, how do I take all the things and adapt them to the context that I'm in a way that serves the context in the house that I'm in excellently, but also loves the people well where I'm at? Because at the end of the day, it's all about the people, Matt. You know that. And if we're not doing our job to love the people well as a worship pastor, then we're not doing our job as a worship pastor. When I boil it down for folks, like when I'll say it this way. So like when I teach worship leaders, like how to be a worship leader, like I say, your job is broken down to three things. It's first to bless the heart of God in secret. It's to remind yourself and the people of God of his character and attributes. And then lastly, it's to give the people of God permission to respond. And so to be able to do that, like you got to be able to slow down enough and focus on relationships and love the people. And like what blesses the heart of God? It's loving your neighbor. It's not a complicated thing, and I saw a quote recently that said something like, it doesn't really matter what you do for your career. It just matters the kind of person that you are, and am I the kind of person that is going to, use God's metrics in the way that I go about my work, or am I going to get sucked into what, social media or, the worship industry is going to tell you is success, and on that note, I'll say this as an aside. I think there's a lot that gets, there's so much like wiser and more talented folks that I'm sure get on this podcast with you and many other podcasts and will say, some really wonderful things and perhaps even some similar things that I've shared today. But I think there's still this subliminal message that gets sent out, like through the worship industry, that, sets this metric or standard of success that just isn't a reality for 99% of churches. Something I'll say his name, Paul Balosh, told me recently was like, there's a prayer that every leader should be praying. It's, God, give me the courage to be who you made me to be, right? Because there's so many leaders out there, leaders like myself, frankly, who like, I'm not at a big church, Matt. Like, I'm not out like doing a lot of these, big things that you'll see on, social media and places. And, I can remember back to younger Erik, and if like he didn't have the moxie, and if God hadn't really if he didn't know in his heart that God called him to do this, there's no way I would have even started, because like I didn't have any of the things that I thought you needed to go do it, right? But what does it look like to take the things that God gives you, like a slingshot and a few stones, and go and do it, and how do we give more people permission to go and take the things that God's given them in the context that they're in to go and create to the glory of God, and not, always be sending a message of like, okay, if it doesn't look like this, then, it's not successful, or it doesn't bless the heart of God, or it's not worth it, in the church, and, I think the idea of giving people permission is incredibly important in the local church capacity on a Sunday morning. Like, give them permission to respond to the goodness of God, but then also, how do we as leaders give people permission to be able to take the things that they've been given in the context that they're in to go and create? And all that's done in community, man, and that's done in relationship. You can't do that alone. Like table songs, man, like we do all these things, and yes, I'm in the middle of it. But like, I would not be sitting here with you right now if it wasn't for all the people that make up table, and serve, all the volunteers and all the people that do the work day in and day out and week in and week out, who, on this call and this, conversation today are nameless, but they're not nameless to Jesus. They're not nameless to the people that like come to the camps or, are involved in the things in the community. Like, there's so many folks who are just pouring their lives out, for others, and it's being done in community, last thing I'll say kind of on it is like, I've found, like, if you look throughout scripture, every time there's like or just history in general, like, every time there's like a move of God, or if God does something, it's always done like through a group of people, a community, and so like when I talk to people and like people who are doing ministry, I always kind of like look like, all right, so great, you're doing something, but like, what's your community? Who's doing it with you? Who are you running with? And who's running with you? And so, I would say if anybody's like wanting to, go out and build something, like, man, bring people with you. Whether you're a worship pastor at a local church trying to build a team, or if you're trying to do something like different, like what we're doing with table songs, like, bring people with you. That's the key.
I love the whole idea of loving the people more than the music. And that's something that actually really drives CCLI and Loop community behind all of the technology we build. And we've always told people that, like, I want the process of creating a set list with tracks to be so easy and simple that you're not spending your whole week working on tracks.
Yeah,
that you could instead take that time and look at your bass player in the face over a cup of coffee and get to know them. Because I feel like there was a day and age when it took so long to put tracks together that people were just looking at their computer most of the week, looking at Planning Center most of the week. And I'm like, you know what? Let's make that stuff doesn't really matter ultimately at the end of the day. And how are you as a worship pastor pastoring your people? And I think we kind of forsake as worship leaders that title in our job description, worship pastor. And maybe even the church, what they're expecting of us is not maybe it needs to lean more towards the pastor part, because it seems like a lot of churches even just expect, really, if they were to write that job title again, in reality of what they expect of you, it's like song singer or set list performer. That's what a lot of worship pastors and worship leaders are doing every week. They're just picking 5 songs in a playlist and then singing it. And we need to remember that pastor and leader is in the title. And what are you doing to pastor your people, to lead them, not just sing songs, but actually leading them, like you said, giving them an invitation to respond, teaching them about worship, leading them, like pulling something out of them that maybe they didn't even know was there, leading the way in how to enter into worship and how to receive from God through song. I just think that I think a lot of worship leaders are forsaking that bit of the responsibility. They're forgetting that part of the job description. You're not just up there to be a great singer and lead a perfect set list. You're there to pastor and lead in worship. Are there any tips or practical ideas you have of, like, when you lead worship, are the things that, or elements that you like to throw into a set that you've found actually really help get people to engage in worship, rather than just kind of staring at you and maybe singing a couple songs from the lyrics on the screen?
Yeah. Practical tools in that. A couple things. One, at least here in the house that I'm at, I've done a lot of work with our worship leaders in being able to know when to give the room space to be able to hear themselves sing. So that means intentionally knowing when to step away from the microphone and giving the room the ability just to hear themselves sing and respond. Because there's something about the room being able to hear themselves worship that inspires worship, right? And also sends a message that, like, hey, like, this isn't a concert. We're not here just watching Erik or whoever sing the song, right? But like, there's a timing factor in that, and there's an awareness factor in that has to be executed. So, but I would say, like, knowing when and how to execute that is can be a really powerful tool, at least here in my house and the places I lead worship. Another thing is knowing, like, how to stop and just address the room and shepherd the room. Like, it's not like you always have to say something really profound, you know? Like, one of the things I love about leading worship at home is that, like, I have relationships with all the people in my church, right? Or most of the people in my church, right? I think a fun one that I'll do sometimes is, like, I'll stop, or even I'll say this, like, I just did this past weekend. At the start of the service, I was like, all right, guys, we're here to worship the Lord this morning. You ready to worship the Lord this morning? Loman, are you ready to worship the Lord this morning? Right? And just being able to call out somebody in your congregation and say, hey, like, connect it to a person. Like, hey, we're here to worship, right? Right, Jeremy? Right? So-and-so, you know? And being able to kind of break that fourth wall, if you want to use the old theater terminology, right? To be able to go in and give them some kind of, connection that breaks up the monotony, right? So I would say those are two things. A third thing is, like, don't be afraid of silence. Don't be afraid of dead space. I think in our world today, we're so focused on, like, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big lover of pad and being able to fill space and all that and atmosphere. But there's something about occasionally being able to just, like, pull the proverbial plug and just let the people sit in silence, you know? Because, like, it is uncomfortable. And, like, allowing them to sit in a little discomfort kind of allows them to, like, kind of take inventory a little bit, you know? To sit there in that space of, like, be still and know that I'm God, you know? I mean, there's another translation that says stop striving and know that I'm God. But, like, in this context, I like the word still because, like, it's like, okay, well, just stop for a second and just behold who he is, you know, in your own inner world for a moment, you know? Like, let's forget about all the production for just a second of a service. We're here for you and Jesus, you know? Mm-hmm. So just take a moment and, you know, like, obviously you'd have to execute that in a very specific way, you know, and some intentionality have to be put into that, but don't be afraid to do that, you know? You know, that's something I've done on a number of occasions. But anyway, those are three things that I kind of use as tools when I think about, leading worship is the biggest thing, just being like, all right, how do I just make this real for them? Like some much wiser men who have gone before me have said, like, your job as a worship leader is to be a host at a barbecue or a tour guide, and so how do I take people on the journey or the mountain of worship, take them up the mountain of worship and stop along the way and be like, hey, over here, look at this view of Jesus, or look over here, look at this view of Jesus. And, and have something to be able to bring for everyone, to be able to have that as an opportunity to encounter the Lord, like internally for us at Table Songs, we talk about the idea of setting the table as a worship leader. There's a conversation that's going to happen between God and his bride on Sunday morning. And what are we doing as a worship leader to set the table, And, a waiter doesn't like get in the middle of the conversation. He's just there to help like facilitate it, And so, what are the tools that we can do to help the bride of Christ and Christ have a conversation that morning, Yeah,
that's great.
Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that.
So for my last question for you, because we're out of time and we've covered so much stuff here, really great stuff. My last question for you is something we're going to start doing here at Worship Fuel. And I'm asking all of the guests to share their favorite right now, like their favorite worship mashup. So like if you're leading worship and there's like 2 songs, maybe it's like a tag you throw onto the end of a song. What is your favorite worship mashup right now?
My favorite worship mashup. There's an old Paul Baloche song called Your Name. And then tagging that chorus into the chorus of an old vertical worship song called Worthy, Worthy. That would be my favorite mashup, because your name is a strong and mighty tower, right? Into holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. It's just every time I do that, there's just a huge lift.
Nothing has the power to save.
Holy, holy is
the Lord God Almighty. Oh man, that is a good one.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a great one.
I love that one. But what's yours? Just curious.
I love going out of What a Beautiful Name into All Hail King. So yours is the kingdom, yours is the power, yours is the name above all names. All hail King Jesus.
Yes, I love that.
All hail the Lord of heaven and earth.
That's strong. I love that. Man,
Erik,
that's such a great question.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on Worship Fuel. Thanks for sharing your wisdom, and thanks for everything you're doing and just pouring into worship leaders and creatives all over the country, man. You're a blessing, and I appreciate your friendship as well.
I love it. Thank you for the time today and for your friendship, and looking forward to going on the adventure with you.
All right, man. We'll see you soon.
Later.
All right, guys, great conversation with Erik Gaylo from Table Songs. Type down in the comments, what is a practical tip you have for getting your congregation to actually engage in worship? Not just singing songs over them, but how do you get them to actually engage with you and to enter into worship? Type down in the comments, let us know, hit the subscribe and like buttons to follow us for future Worship Fuel episodes. See you soon.